This is part one of the lecture, Mexico's PRI, which is pronounced the PRI, and the challenge of a one-party state. The PRI, and we'll get to this, is the Revolutionary Institutional Party. And, you know, Mexico, one of the arguments of the class is that Mexico has consistently been in the vanguard of Latin American history, particularly in the 20th century. The revolution, which began in 1910, really represented the first serious break with economic liberalism, a break that we see almost everywhere else in the hemisphere with the 1930, onset of the Great Depression. Moreover, in that revolution, you had Emiliano Zapata, you had Pancho Villa, and you had other popular class groups, including the Red Battalions, remember the workers who side with the constitutionalists. And this is really one of the first times in Latin America that we have a real kind of popular class pushing for political liberalism, political democracy. And then we have the winners, the constitutionalists, and then Cárdenas, who is an heir to the constitutionalists, had fought with them. They continued to question economic liberalism. So Mexico's a place that, at least during the revolution into the 20s and 30s, has a kind of more interest in political liberalism than economic liberalism, and that's turning the old formula, the Latin American formula of free trade but no democracy, capitalism, no democracy. Now it's I don't know if I'd call it democracy, but it's a form of democracy with questions about the economy. And the Cárdenas years were a very interesting kind of mix of a sort of political liberalism with some state intervention in the democracy, in the economy. And we saw that, in that lecture on Cardenista populism, that his experiences in the revolution, fighting the revolution, his experiences as the governor of Michoacán, fighting the Cristeros, convinced him that you really had to balance everything, that you couldn't go too far with one thing or another. And that, that's the argument behind saying that's why he didn't, when he chose his successor, he did not push for someone who was going to push Mexico even further to the left. Quite the contrary, he chose someone who was more conservative and would maybe move things back to the center or even the right. He chose Manuel Ávila Camacho. But Cárdenas was also interested not just in the agrarian reform, not just in the creation of the national oil company Pemex. He was very interested in consolidating a Mexican state by saying, all these things we've done from the revolution through the 1920s, through my period, we need ways to make sure that it will continue, not just the previous 20 years, maybe even 25 years, but on into the future. And if you go back to the lecture on Cardenista populism, you'll see that he reorganized the party several times. And after Cárdenas has left power, the party is finally reorganized one more time into its current form. And it becomes the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which is the Revolutionary Institutional Party. And that party, which again is an heir to the Constitutionalists, so we can say it goes all the way back to 1917, but with that name in its current form, it's founded in January of 1946. And for the 20th century, essentially, the rest of the 20th century, Mexico is a one-party state, and that PRI is the party. Now, it's a history class, so it's always fun to do this, but the PRI was really the latest incarnation of the constitutionalists. So these people who, come together. You could even say that they're the people who get rid of Madero, and not get rid of Madero, who are with Madero, get rid of Diaz in 1910. Now, the previous parties were the Partido Nacional Revolucionario, which had been founded in 1929 by Calles, and Cárdenas reforms that, right? That's the PNR. He creates the PRM. You would never be asked on an exam to know all of these, but it's worth kind of just seeing the progression. Cárdenas, changed its name and altered its structure a little bit, and it became the Partido de la Revolución Mexicana. And at the end of his term, Ávila Camacho altered the structure a bit more and renamed it the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. And that's the name of the party today. And it said, we're one big party, and we represent the popular will. Things are worked out through our party. And our structure is in itself a form of democracy. And it provides for the revolutionary identity of Mexicans. It's very important that no matter how long these guys are in office, that they still lay claim to being revolutionary. And the idea was that if you are in the PRI or you support the PRI or you vote for the PRI, you are essentially supporting and voting for and being part of an ongoing revolution, the revolution of Madero, the revolution of Obregón and Carranza. And even though they defeat Villa and Zapata, particularly Zapata, they make a hero of the revolution. Zapata is a heroic figure in Mexico, and the PRI really pushes that in public education and so forth. Now, the PRI is a complicated institution, and everyone knew essentially that it was not democratic and it wasn't revolutionary. Its biggest supporters had a funny way of talking about it. They said, look, we're a work in progress. Give us a chance. And we're going to try to be as revolutionary and democratic as we can, but there are limitations to what we can do. The PRI's critics said, look, you guys are just a bunch of thugs. You're just authoritarians. I mean, I think in the 60s and 70s, people say you're not that dissimilar from the Brazilian military. You just have this veneer of elections, which you never lose and you seem to control. And in some ways, the state really did act almost criminally, that the state didn't own newspapers, but it controlled the access to all the paper that newspapers were printed on. The state controlled whether or not television stations could remain on the air. And so they never had to censor anything. The owners of the media knew that they were in trouble if they went against the regime, but the owners of the media tended to be regime supporters. But I have there that sometimes they would act like a protection racket. And what I mean by that is if they were industrialists, and there were industrialists who didn't like the government, then the government would side with those industrialist workers during a strike and say, no, you got to give them a raise. We're going to use this corporatist labor system. You owe them a raise. And so that was a way in which, elites often grudgingly supported the state because the state was all powerful in that way. The state controlled the unions, the state controlled access to natural resources, to electricity generation, to anything. And so you had to essentially pay off the state, support the state, or running your business was going to be very difficult. Now, as I've mentioned, the PRI, with various names, various iterations, controlled Mexico. I think you can say 1917, 1920, whatever you want to say. But essentially from Álvaro Obregón's election until they lost power to a guy named Vicente Fox in the election in 2000. So it's a good 80 years that they ran it. So how is it that the constitutionalists managed to hold power for 80 years? I mean, that's impressive. Well, the party used a very clever combination of co-optation and repression. So what is co-optation? Co-optation is, we'll give you stuff if you are loyal to us. We will maintain an agrarian reform if the peasants support us. We will help workers get good wages if they're in government-sponsored unions. It's a structure that rewards loyalty. Now, the other thing they did is if you insisted on opposing them, you were often harassed. When you wouldn't accept the deal, you faced problems. And if you were a poor person, it could be a lot of violence. For more middle class and elite opponents, the government simply was in the habit of making your life miserable. So again, if you're a loyalist, you get stuff. If you're an opponent, your life is tough. And that's how a one-party state exists for so long. Now, the other thing about it is there was an enormous Congress, an enormous bureaucracy, but power was very much concentrated in the hands of the president. It was a presidentialist system with an extremely weak legislature, a legislature that could do almost nothing. And presidents, as you saw with Cárdenas, served a single 6-year term, which was known as the sexenio. And much of this was started, many of the traditions around this were started by Cárdenas himself. Even though he had been guaranteed victory, because it was a very corrupt system back then, he chose to campaign. And this is what happens. The president chooses his successor, and then that successor campaigns throughout the country. There's a great pageant of democracy, even though that person is definitely going to win. And the other thing that's sort of traditional in these sexenios is that you often, not always, but often will pick someone who is politically a little different than you. The idea is that you have a kind of pendulum swing in politics. Well, I've consolidated this, and then you can do that. Another thing, since these guys all come from the same party, is it's very traditional for the outgoing president in his final months in office to kind of do everything that's unpopular that needs to be done. I'll clean up this mess. I'll, change whatever economic policy or political policy needs to be changed because I'll take all the heat, and then you can start your term with more of a clean slate. And that shows you the kind of one-party nature of it, that these guys are individuals and they have, individual worldviews, but they're all in it for the same kind of set of ideas, and we can trace them all the way back to what the constitutionalists fought for during the Revolution.